I will never forget the day I stepped into that courtroom, not because of the case I was there for, but because of what happened to me. My world was shattered in that room, but I somehow found a way to rebuild it piece by piece. I was just 19, fresh out of high school, trying to navigate life on my own. I never thought I'd be in a courtroom at this point, but life has a way of throwing you curveballs. I was there as a witness for a family friend involved in a minor dispute. Nothing serious, really. I wasn't prepared for the humiliation that was about to unfold. It was a regular morning. The courthouse was filled with the usual crowd, a mix of lawyers, defendants, families, and people like me who had to be there for whatever reason. But as soon as I walked into that courtroom, I felt all eyes on me. I didn't think much of it at first. People look, I thought. It's nothing new. But then the judge, an older white man with a thick, harsh voice, called the case. And it all went downhill from there. As I walked to the witness stand, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The cold wood of the chair felt too hard against my legs, the air too thick. I didn't want to be there, but I had no choice. I answered the questions asked of me, trying my best to stay calm. But then, without any warning, the judge spoke up. You know, it's surprising that you're here, considering. Well, we don't often see people like you in positions like this. Are you sure you even understand what's going on? His words hit me like a slap in the face. I was shocked. The courtroom went silent. The other people in the room stared, waiting for my response, as if they expected me to break down. The words kept echoing in my mind. People like you. It was like he didn't even see me as a person, just a stereotype, and I could tell he wasn't even trying to hide it. It felt like time stopped. I wanted to leave. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to make him feel as small as he was making me feel. But I couldn't. I was trapped, and the weight of that moment was suffocating. I looked around the courtroom, expecting to see anyone come to my defense. But all I saw were faces that looked away, avoiding eye contact. The only one who didn't look away was the judge, staring at me with that cold, smug expression, waiting for my reaction. He thought he had me. And then, I did something I'll never forget. I took a deep breath, stood up straight, and said, "I understand perfectly well, Your Honor. I understand that I'm here to speak the truth, and no amount of your ignorance will change that." The room was silent again. I could feel every single person in that courtroom shift uncomfortably. The judge's face flushed, his mouth opening and closing as if he were trying to find the right words to argue back. But he couldn't. He stuttered something about respecting the court, but I didn't listen. All I could think about was how long I had been made to feel small because of people like him. People who think they have power over others just because of the color of their skin. People who forget that, no matter how hard they try, you can't erase someone's dignity. I finished my testimony, but I'll never forget the look on the judge's face as I left the stand. He was no longer smug. He was defeated. Afterward, I went back to the waiting room, my heart still racing, but something inside me had changed. I had been humiliated in front of so many people, but in that moment I realized something powerful. I had refused to let that humiliation define me. It might have shaken me, but it didn't break me. Weeks later, I heard that the judge had been under review for his behavior. People started speaking out about the way he treated me. He was caught in a scandal that would follow him for years. Some said it was karma. Some said it was justice. I didn't care what people said. I knew the truth. I had stood my ground, and that was all that mattered. The months after that courtroom incident were a blur. I didn't know it at the time, but my response in that room would end up becoming a turning point, not just for me, but for others too. The story spread quickly, as these things often do. Word of the judge's comments made its way to local news, and before I knew it, I was being interviewed by reporters. I wasn't prepared for the media attention. I was just a young woman trying to make it through life, trying to get by without things like this happening to me. But it felt different this time. The more people shared my story, the more I realized that my small act of defiance had struck a chord with people. I remember one interview where I had to sit in front of a camera, answering questions, trying to explain what had happened. They asked me how I felt about the judge's comments. And I said something that still rings true today. I've learned that people can try to tear you down, but they can never take away your power unless you let them. I didn't know how those words would resonate with people, but I saw the flood of messages that came in afterward, messages from people who had felt the same hurt, the same sting of being judged, before they even spoke a word. I received messages from other Black women, many who had experienced similar humiliation, some in courts, some in classrooms, some in everyday life. It was heartbreaking to hear their stories. It made me realize that my experience wasn't unique. It was part of a larger, ugly pattern that we all had to deal with. But the more we shared our stories, the stronger we became. One particular message stood out to me. It was from a woman who had been in a similar situation with a judge, someone who had made assumptions about her based solely on her race, just as the judge had done to me. She wrote, "Thank you for showing me that I don't have to accept this. You gave me my voice back." That message, and so many others, made me realize that what happened in that courtroom wasn't just about one racist judge. It was about all of us who had to endure these moments of injustice. But it was also about how we could rise above them, how we could use our voices to expose the truth, and how we could demand respect. Despite all of this, life didn't suddenly become easy. The pain from that day stayed with me, especially whenever I thought about the people who had stayed silent in the courtroom, who hadn't come to my defense. But I also realized something important. Their silence didn't matter anymore. I had spoken up, and my voice was stronger than ever. The judge's career eventually crumbled. There were investigations, protests, and outcry over his behavior. He was removed from the bench, but I wasn't celebrating his downfall. I wasn't interested in seeing someone lose their job because of what they had done to me. It was the principle that mattered. It was the fact that the world could see that the hurt he caused had consequences. But even with all the attention, I stayed focused on my own path. I didn't let what had happened consume me. I focused on school, on building my future, on finding peace within myself. It wasn't easy. Some days the memory of that moment would come rushing back, and I would feel the anger bubbling up. But I refused to let it control me. I learned to channel that energy into something better, into the life I wanted to build for myself, into the work I could do to help others. And I realized that I didn't have to wait for anyone else to stand up for me. I had already done that. That moment, that response, would echo through my life forever, reminding me that no one, no matter how much power they thought they had, could ever take my dignity away from me again. As the months passed, I became more and more involved in advocacy. I knew I had to do something with the attention I had gotten, and the best way I could repay the people who had reached out to me was to give back. I started volunteering with organizations that fought for racial justice, equality in the legal system, and support for victims of racial discrimination. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes it felt like I was pushing against a wall, but I kept going because I knew that the wall wouldn't stay up forever if enough of us kept pushing. I also started speaking at events, sharing my story with others. I didn't want to be a victim. I refused to be. I wanted to be a voice for others who couldn't speak out, for those who felt silenced or invisible. In those moments, I realized just how many people were out there fighting their own battles, just like I had. There were so many of us who had been humiliated, overlooked, and dismissed, and together we could create a wave of change. There was one event in particular that stands out to me. It was a community gathering where activists, lawyers, and survivors of discrimination came together to share their stories. I was nervous, but when I stood up to speak, something inside me clicked. I spoke about that day in the courtroom, about the humiliation I felt, but also about the strength I found in that moment. I talked about how the judge had tried to break me, and how, instead, I had found my power. Afterward, a woman came up to me. She had tears in her eyes. "I had the same thing happen to me," she said. "I just didn't know how to stand up. You showed me how." It was moments like that that reminded me why I couldn't let my story fade away. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about the people who needed to hear that there was still hope, that they weren't alone. And yet, there were still people who tried to dismiss what had happened. There were still those who said it wasn't a big deal, that it was just one bad judge, or that I had overreacted. But their opinions didn't matter. I had learned the hard way that there would always be people who refused to see the truth. What mattered was that I saw it. And, more importantly, I had made sure others saw it too. Over time, the pain of that day faded, but the lessons stayed with me. I had learned the value of standing up for myself. I had learned that silence wasn't an option. And I had learned that the fight for justice didn't end in one courtroom. It was an ongoing battle, one that we all had to keep fighting. Years later, I was sitting in a meeting with a group of lawyers, talking about potential cases of racial discrimination in the legal system. A file was passed to me, and as I glanced at it, I saw the name of the judge who had humiliated me all those years ago. For a brief moment, my heart stopped, but then I smiled. It wasn't the same anger that had boiled up in me before. It wasn't rage. It was a quiet satisfaction, a feeling that justice was still at work, even if it came slowly. I had come a long way since that day in court. I had found my voice and used it to demand change, and I wasn't done yet. There were still battles to be fought, but now I knew that I had the strength to face them. When I think back to that courtroom, I don't just see the judge's cruel words. I see how far I've come. And I see the many others who are standing right beside me, each of us finding our own voice and using it to make the world a better place. And that, I realize now, is the real power we all have, not just to speak out, but to make sure our voices are heard. As time went on, the work I was doing to fight for racial justice grew. I wasn't just advocating for changes in the legal system anymore. I was pushing for systemic changes that would impact communities, schools, and workplaces. I knew that what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of something much bigger. That realization became the foundation of my work, and I began to understand just how much we needed to change, not just the system but also the attitudes that fueled it. One day, I received an invitation to speak at a conference on racial inequality. It was a big opportunity, and while I was proud of everything I'd done up until that point, I couldn't help but think back to that courtroom. The judge's words still haunted me, even as my work continued to grow. But when I stepped onto the stage, I felt different. I wasn't the young woman who had walked into that courtroom years ago. I had transformed. I spoke about the personal toll of racism, how it was more than just the obvious moments of discrimination. It was the small things, the assumptions people made when they saw me, the way I was often treated like I didn't belong. But I also spoke about hope, about how the same system that tried to break me could also be changed, with enough determination. At the end of my speech, I looked out at the audience. There were so many faces, young and old, black and white, men and women who were all listening, and I saw something in their eyes. It wasn't just sympathy. It was a shared understanding, a recognition that the work we were doing was bigger than any one person. It was a movement, and we were all part. Afterward, a man came up to me. He introduced himself as a lawyer, and we began to talk about the challenges that Black people face in the legal system. He told me that hearing my story had inspired him to do more to fight for change in his own practice. And as we talked, I realized just how much my experience had contributed to a larger conversation, a conversation that was slowly but surely making a difference. In the years that followed, I continued to push for reform, to speak out when I saw injustice, and to support those who were just starting to find their own voices. I learned that no one could break me, no matter how hard they tried. I'd been humiliated, but I had risen from it. And every time I spoke out, I felt the weight of that moment in the courtroom lift just a little more. The judge, who had once tried to break me, had long since been removed from the bench, and his name became a symbol of accountability in the fight for racial justice. His downfall wasn't just about his actions, it was about the courage of those who had stood up, who had refused to be silent, who had shown the world that power doesn't come from oppression but from the will to fight for what's right. In the end, it wasn't about the judge. It wasn't even about me. It was about the collective strength of a community, the power of our voices, and the undeniable truth that change is possible when we all stand together. And that's the legacy I wanted to leave behind. That one moment of humiliation didn't define me. What defined me and what will always define me was my refusal to stay silent and the courage to stand up, not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been told they don't matter. As the years passed, I found myself reflecting more and more on the journey I'd been on. It hadn't always been easy. There were days when the weight of everything would threaten to overwhelm me. But I realized that every challenge I had faced, every uncomfortable conversation, and every time I had spoken up had only made me strong. My work had started to expand into creating programs for young people of color, especially Black youth, who might not have anyone guiding them through the complexities of the world. I knew how hard it could be to find your voice when everything around you was telling you to be quiet, to conform, to blend in. But I also knew that I had a responsibility to show them that their voice mattered, that their perspective could change the world. Through community initiatives, workshops, and school programs, I met so many incredible young people who had been through struggles I could relate to. They told me about the challenges they faced in school, in their neighborhoods, in their homes, and in the larger world. I saw how many of them, like me, were starting to realize that their stories mattered. And as I listened to them, I knew I wasn't alone in my mission to fight for change. We were all in this together, and we were all powerful in our own way. One of the most rewarding parts of my work was mentoring young women. Many of them had faced racism and discrimination, some from people in positions of power, just like I had. I would sit with them, listen to their stories, and help them realize that they didn't have to carry the weight of the world on their own. They didn't have to accept being silenced or overlooked. They had the right to be heard, to demand respect, and to hold others accountable for their actions. I remember one young woman, Maria, who had been harassed by her teacher at school. He would make degrading comments about her hair, about her skin color, and would often call on her last in class, making her feel invisible. When she came to me for advice, I could see the fear in her eyes. She was afraid that speaking out would only make things worse. I told her about my own experience, about how I had been humiliated by someone in power, and how it had taken everything in me to respond the way I did. I reminded her that she had every right to stand up for herself. Maria did just that. With guidance and support, she wrote a formal complaint to the school administration and spoke up in front of her classmates about the teacher's behavior. Her courage opened the door for other students to share their own experiences. The teacher was eventually placed under review, and the school system was forced to confront the ways it had been allowing racist behavior to slide. Maria didn't just change her life in that moment, she changed the lives of others in her community. And watching her do that reminded me of the power we all have when we choose to speak. As I continued on this path, I became more involved in advocacy on a broader scale, partnering with legal professionals to push for legislative changes aimed at ending racial discrimination within the justice system. I lobbied for reforms that would protect Black and brown people from being unfairly treated or persecuted based on their race. It was a long fight, but it was one that I knew I couldn't back down from. We had come so far, but there was still so much work to be done. I started traveling around the country to speak at rallies, town halls, and conferences, always reminding people that real change is a long process. Sometimes it takes years to see the results, but that didn't mean we should stop fighting. Every action, no matter how small, added to the momentum. Every time we stood up, we made a difference. And through it all, I never forgot that day in the courtroom, the moment when a racist judge tried to humiliate me. It wasn't the day that broke me, as he had intended. It was the day that made me realize that I could be part of something bigger than myself. It was the day I found my purpose. And as I looked at the young people I was mentoring, the community I was building, and the changes we were making, I knew that the humiliation I had faced had been a small part of a much larger story, a story that was still being written. And that story was one of strength, of resilience, of love, and most importantly, of justice. As the years went on, the impact of the work I had been a part of grew. I began to see tangible changes, laws that were passed, policies that were altered, and institutions that began to hold themselves accountable in ways they hadn't before. I watched as the voices of people who had been silenced for so long grew louder and stronger, demanding the respect they deserved. It was a slow process, but it was real. I continued to work with organizations pushing for reform, advocating for marginalized communities, and helping to create spaces where people could speak freely about their struggles and their hopes for the future. But I also took moments to reflect on the past and the young woman I had been when I first walked into that courtroom, humiliated by a racist judge. I could hardly recognize her anymore. She had been lost in shame, in fear, and in doubt. But she had found something powerful within herself, something that had carried her through the darkest moments. That power came from the people who had supported me along the way, me family, friends, mentors, and the many others who had faced similar experiences and had shared their stories with me. It was the people who had shown up when it mattered most, who had reminded me that I wasn't alone in this fight. Together, we were building a legacy of change that would outlast any judge, any law, any system designed to keep us down. One day, years after I had first spoken up in that courtroom, I received a letter from the family of the judge who had humiliated me. It was a strange thing to receive a letter filled with apology and regret. The judge had passed away by then, but his family wanted to express their sorrow for his actions, for the way he had treated me, and for the pain he had caused. They acknowledged that his behavior had been wrong, and that his actions had left a lasting mark, not only on me, but on others he had judged unfairly during his time on the bench. The letter was a mixture of emotions for me. It was unexpected, and part of me wanted to dismiss it. It didn't change what had happened. It didn't take away the pain I'd felt in that courtroom, nor did it erase the ways I'd had to fight to regain my dignity. But as I read through the words, I felt a quiet sense of closure, not because I needed an apology, but because I realized how far I had come, how much I had grown, and how much had changed. That letter wasn't the final chapter of my story. It wasn't a resolution that made everything feel right, but it was a reminder that sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected places. And even when people don't understand the damage they cause in the moment, there's always room for growth, for change, for redemption. In the end, I never did it for the recognition or for the apologies. I did it because I wanted to make sure that no one else would ever have to endure what I had gone through without knowing that they could rise above. I wanted to ensure that others, especially young Black people like myself, would understand that their worth wasn't defined by anyone else's narrow view of them. And as I looked at the work we were continuing to do, at the changes that were happening in the world, I knew that the fight wasn't over. But I also knew that I had become part of something bigger than myself. My voice, which had once been quiet in that courtroom, had grown louder and more powerful over time, and together with all the other voices calling for justice, we were changing the world. As the years passed, I found myself in places I never imagined I'd be. I stood before large audiences at rallies, conferences, and panels talking about the system that had tried to break me and how we could work together to dismantle it. But I never forgot that small courtroom, the echoes of the judge's humiliating words, and how they had sparked a fire inside me that had never gone out. One of the most powerful moments came when I was invited to speak at a national event focused on racial equity and justice. It wasn't just a gathering of activists or lawyers, it was a platform for policymakers, business leaders, and educators who held the power to make sweeping changes. As I prepared for the speech, I thought back to that judge and the years that had followed. The shame, the pain, the anger, it had all been part of the process, but they didn't define me anymore. The speech was my chance to stand before a room full of people who had the power to make real, lasting change. I talked about what it was like to be judged not for who you are, but for how someone else sees you, to have your worth decided before you even open your mouth. I told them how, for so long, I had been told by the world that my voice didn't matter, that I wasn't enough. But I also told them that those days were over. I used to think I was just one person, and that meant I couldn't make a difference, I said. But I learned that it's not about being the loudest voice in the room, it's about being the one who refuses to be silent. It's about standing up and showing the world that your truth matters. My story matters. Your story matters. The room was silent as I spoke, and I could see people nodding, writing things down. It wasn't about praise, it was about the realization that this fight for equality wasn't just mine. It was everyone. Every person who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. When I finished, the applause was overwhelming. But what meant the most to me wasn't the applause. It was the conversations I had afterward, the faces of people who told me that my words had inspired them to take action, to stand up in their own community, to demand better from the systems that had failed them for so long. A few months later, I was invited to be a part of a national task force that was working on criminal justice reform. The people I met were incredibly passionate, and I could see how hard they were fighting to fix the issues that I had experienced firsthand. Working alongside them, I felt like we were building something bigger than any one of us. A movement that had begun with a single moment of humiliation in a courtroom was now part of a nationwide conversation on how we could change the systems that had been designed to hurt people like me. But even as I stood beside some of the most influential voices in the fight for justice, I knew it wasn't enough to simply change the laws or the structure. The real work had to be done in the hearts and minds of people. That's why, in addition to the legislative work, I continued my community-based efforts talking to young people, hosting workshops, and encouraging others to find their voices. It became clear to me that real change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the everyday interactions, in the conversations that take place when no one is watching. It happens when people take a stand, even when they're afraid. It happens when we stop accepting the status quo and start demanding that the world sees us for who we truly are, not for the color of our skin, but for the people we are on the inside. Looking back now, I see how far we've come and how much further we have to go. The fight for racial equality is ongoing, and it's bigger than any one person. But I'm proud to have been part of that journey, proud of the work we've done and the changes we've made. And I'll keep fighting, because I know that the young people I'm mentoring today will carry this work forward. I often think about that judge. I think about how he tried to break me, how he assumed I would crumble under the weight of his words. But what he didn't know was that those words only fueled my fight. He thought he had the power to humiliate me. What he didn't understand was that, by trying to tear me down, he unknowingly made me stronger. My story doesn't end with him or with that courtroom. It doesn't end with me either. It's a part of something much larger, a movement that has been building for generations. And as long as there is work to be done, I'll be there, standing with the countless others who refuse to be silenced, who refuse to be broken, and who believe that change is possible. As the movement continued to grow, so did my understanding of what true justice would look like. I began to realize that while laws and policies were essential, the fight for racial equity needed to address deep-rooted societal norms and mindsets, those invisible walls that kept inequality in place. True change would only come when people from all walks of life truly understood the lived experiences of others and were willing to confront their own biases. One of the most eye-opening experiences for me came when I started to sit down with people who didn't share my perspective. People who, like that judge, had no idea what it was like to walk in my shoes. They came from different backgrounds, different social circles, and different beliefs. At first, I was hesitant. It's easy to get wrapped up in the anger you feel when you've been wronged, to want to shut people out who don't understand your struggle. But I also knew that if I wanted to make a real difference, I had to try to connect with those who might not see the world the way I did. Through these conversations, I began to see just how important it was to build bridges, even with people whose views I found difficult to understand. It wasn't about convincing them that I was right and they were wrong. It was about opening their eyes to the truth of what it means to live as a Black person in a society that often doesn't value you. And just as importantly, it was about helping them see the humanity in others, the simple truth that we all deserve respect, dignity, and the chance to succeed, regardless of the color of our skin. One conversation stands out in particular. It was with a middle-aged white man who had grown up in a small, conservative town. He was in his 50s, had never left the state, and had never really interacted with many Black people. His views were shaped by a lifetime of limited exposure to diversity. He was upfront about his discomfort with the conversation, but we still sat down to talk. At first, it felt like hitting a brick wall. He struggled to understand why certain things I said were so painful to me, why something as seemingly simple as being treated with dignity could feel so radical. But as we talked more, as I shared my experiences of growing up Black in America, of the microaggressions, the systemic barriers, and the deep, often subtle ways racism manifests in daily life, something shifted. He began to listen, not just with his ears but with his heart. The turning point came when I told him about my experience in that courtroom all those years ago. I explained how the judge's words had made me feel less than human, like my presence didn't matter. I could see his expression change as he understood the depth of my pain. "You're telling me that this is something that happens regularly?" he asked, his voice softening. I nodded, and we talked more about the ways racism wasn't just about overt acts of violence, but the quiet, pervasive ways it takes shape through words, assumptions, and systems that favor certain people over others. We spoke for hours that day, and while I knew he hadn't completely changed his views in one conversation, I could see the seeds of understanding being planted. The next time we spoke, he had questions, and he was more open. He began doing his own research, listening to podcasts, reading books, and seeking out voices of Black people who were sharing their stories. It wasn't a perfect transformation, but it was progress. In that moment, I understood the real power of sharing your story not just for the sake of speaking out, but for opening up a pathway to understanding. Because at the end of the day, we can't expect people to change if they don't first see and feel the truth of what we've lived. And we can't build a better world if we don't work to break down the walls that divide us. As I continued to work with more communities, I noticed how much more receptive people were when they felt included in the conversation. The more I shared, the more others started sharing their own experiences, even if they weren't the same as mine. I realized that, in many ways, my fight was not only about racial justice, but about connection, about fostering empathy and understanding, even in spaces where it felt impossible. I had been humiliated by a system that wanted to erase my humanity, but now, every time I spoke, I was reclaiming that humanity. I was making sure no one else had to go through the same thing, that their voices would be heard too. And so, I kept moving forward. I knew that the journey wasn't over, that we still had so much to fight for. The systems had begun to change, but people's hearts and minds needed to keep evolving. And I was determined to be part of that change, speaking up, standing with others, and continuing the fight for justice, not just for me, but for all those who had been left out, silenced, or ignored. Every step, no matter how small, was a victory. Every conversation, no matter how difficult, was a step closer to creating the world we all deserve. And, in the end, that was enough for me. As I moved forward, the work I was doing began to take on a deeper sense of purpose. I wasn't just advocating for change anymore. I was helping build a foundation for future generations. The more I thought about the young people I worked with, the more I realized that they were the ones who would shape the world in the long run. Their voices were just beginning to rise, and I wanted to make sure they had every opportunity to stand tall, proud of who they were. I spent time traveling to schools, community centers, and youth organizations, speaking with students who were dealing with the same kinds of challenges I had faced. Many of them were already so aware of the systemic racism that existed in their lives, but I could see the fear in their eyes, the fear that no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they succeeded, there would always be barriers in their way. They had already experienced the sting of being dismissed or misunderstood. But I was determined to show them that their power came from within, and that they had the ability to change the narrative, not just for themselves, but for the world around them. One day, I was invited to a high school in a working-class neighborhood to speak to a group of students about my experiences and how they could navigate their own struggles with racism. At first, the room was full of skepticism. It's hard to imagine a 16-year-old, someone who's still figuring out who they are, being open to hearing advice from someone who's lived through so much. But as I shared my story, as I talked about how I had been humiliated, how I had learned to turn pain into strength, and how I had found my voice, something shifted. They started listening not just to my words, but to the possibility that they could write their own story. One student, a quiet young man named Malik, approached me afterward. His eyes were full of emotion, but he was holding back. I could see he wanted to say something but was hesitant. Finally, he spoke up, his voice shaking. "I don't know if I could ever do what you did. I don't think I could stand up in front of someone like that," he said, referring to the judge who had humiliated me. I put a hand on his shoulder and looked him in the eyes. "You're stronger than you think. It's not about standing up to someone in a single moment. It's about finding the strength to keep going even when you feel like the world is trying to hold you down. Every small act of courage, every time you speak out, it adds up." That conversation with Malik stayed with me. In that moment, I understood that the fight for racial justice wasn't just about pushing for systemic change, it was about empowering people to recognize their own worth, to know that they had the power to change the world, even when the world made them feel small. Over time, I realized that these conversations, these moments of connection, were just as important as the larger policy changes. Yes, the laws and systems had to change, but the work we were doing at the community level, the conversations, the mentorship, the shared experiences was what would sustain the movement. It was the building blocks of a future where young people like Malik could see a world where they weren't defined by what others saw in them, but by what they believed about themselves. That realization led me to start an initiative specifically aimed at mentoring young Black men and women. We focused not only on their academic and professional futures, but also on their emotional and mental well-being. We created a space where they could talk about their struggles, share their fears, and build the confidence to take on the world. I wanted them to know that they were not alone, that the power to change their circumstances didn't lie in someone else's hands but within their own hearts and minds. I remember one of our first meetings, a group of young Black men sitting in a circle, listening intently as I shared my story. They were all from different walks of life, some from broken homes, others who had grown up in neighborhoods plagued by violence, but there was a shared understanding among them. They had all faced rejection, they had all dealt with being underestimated, and they all knew what it felt like to be invisible. One of the men, a 21-year-old named Xavier, raised his hand after I spoke. "You think we can really change this?" he asked, his voice full of uncertainty. I smiled and nodded. "I know you can. It's not about waiting for someone else to change things for you. You have the power. It starts with you." The look in Xavier's eyes softened, and I could see that the weight of his doubt had begun to lift. It was moments like that, small, quiet moments of realization, that kept me going. As I continued my work, I started seeing the ripple effects of the movement we had begun. Young people were stepping into leadership roles in their communities, advocating for their peers, challenging injustice wherever they saw. Many of them had faced the same struggles I had, but they were determined to fight for a future where they didn't have to be defined by their circumstances. They were reclaiming their narratives and writing new stories for themselves. The more I mentored, the more I saw how vital it was to not just fight against the systems that tried to oppress us, but to build the systems we wanted to see in the world. It wasn't enough to tear down barriers. We had to create new paths, new opportunities, and new spaces for the next generation to thrive. And I knew, as I watched these young leaders rise, that the world was changing, slowly but surely. And it was the stories of those who had been humiliated, dismissed, and overlooked that were shaping that change. I had walked into that courtroom years ago as a young woman who thought her voice didn't matter, but I had left it a fight. And as I looked at the young people around me, I knew that their voices would echo far beyond the walls that had once tried to keep us silent. The fight wasn't over, but with every conversation, every story shared, every person who stood up for what was right, we were getting closer to a world where no one had to prove their worth, where every voice mattered, and where no one would ever have to feel invisible again.
Hey there! If this story moved you, don't forget to hit subscribe to join me for more powerful real-life stories that spark change and inspire strength. Together, we can explore stories of resilience, justice, and the moments that make a difference. Your support helps amplify voices that need to be heard, so let's grow this community of changemakers. Click subscribe now, and let's continue this journey together.